Attila the Hun. So it's the year 450 CE, and you're a peasant in your little European village, peacefully sipping your morning mead. However, you suddenly feel a tiny earthquake, but this one is from all the sound of hundreds of thundering horses led by Attila the Hun, the ultimate party crasher in ancient Europe. So basically, Attila was the ruthless king of the Huns, a nomadic tribe from Central Asia that specialized in being terrifying. If there were a medieval version of the Grammys, Attila would take the award home as the most destructive warlord. Think of him as that friend who shows up to your house, wrecks everything, and eats all your snacks with no remorse or care. Attila and his army would roll into towns and liberate everything of value, and best believe they would burn down every living thing in sight to achieve this. In fact, the Eastern Roman Empire was so scared and tired of him that they literally had to pay him a huge sum to stop attacking them. At this point, it's safe to say he basically invented the ancient version of "pay me or I'll break your stuff." Now, when Attila wasn't demanding money, he was busy leading his warriors into battle. The Huns were famous for their swift horse-riding archers, which made them the medieval version of drive-by shooters. Their approach to battle was simple: show up, scare the living daylights out of everyone, loot the place, and ride off into the sunset like it's no big deal. In a twist of fate, Attila surprisingly died in his sleep after his marriage, and for someone so ruthless and mighty, that was a very unceremonious way to go. The NOAB of Dunat, India. Everybody loves dogs. They're such adorable creatures, great for company, and sometimes they even help with mental and physical health. However, the king of India, NOAB of Dunat, took his own love for dogs to a whole new and unreasonable level. Now, you might think, oh, that's cute, a ruler who loves animals, but hold your leash because this was no ordinary love. The NOAB had over 800 dogs that were treated better than most humans. Each dog had a personal servant, a royal wardrobe, a golden throne, and royal parades. That is not even all because, wait for it, when one of them got married, yes, dog weddings, the celebrations were bigger than most human weddings. We're talking about gold-plated invitations, feasts, fireworks, and the whole shebang. Now, the reason why this was so bad was because the people of Dunat were as poor as church rats. Imagine being so poor you didn't know where your next meal was coming from, only to hear that the king was having a feast because his dogs were getting married. The worst part of it was that the money the so-called king used to throw all his excessive extravagant parties for him and his dogs all came from taxes. The state coffers were drained, but hey, at least the dogs were living like royalty, and that's all that mattered. However, things went from bad to worse for the Dunat citizens in 1947, when this guy decided to join Pakistan instead of accepting the independence that was offered to them by India. Can you imagine being given freedom and deciding to just keep being a slave? This was the move that finally broke the camel's back because the people had had enough. There was chaos everywhere, and even the Indian government had to step in. Eventually, the Nawab, realizing his mistake, fled to Pakistan, abandoning his state, his people, and even his dogs. Yep, the same dogs he'd been obsessing over for years were left behind as he ran off with his fortune. Not only was this guy selfish and greedy, he was also a pretty spineless king. King J of the Shah dynasty. King J was like that guy who inherited the family business and promptly drove it into the ground. His reign was marked by extreme hedonism, meaning he threw epic parties while his kingdom crumbled around him. Picture this: King J lounging in a lake of wine. Yes, you heard that right, a literal lake of alcohol, surrounded by naked dancers and entertainers. The guy was so obsessed with pleasure that he built a massive meat forest, where trees were made of wood and hung with grilled meats. Honestly, it sounds like something out of a medieval barbecue festival gone way too far. But it wasn't all fun and games in King J's court because his cruelty was legendary. He treated his subjects like disposable party favors and was notorious for his love of torture. One of his favorite methods was something called the burning pillar, a slick metal tube that was heated red hot. Prisoners were forced to walk across it, burning alive as they tried to cling to the slippery surface. If you so much as looked at him wrong, you were likely to end up as a snack for the burning pillar. Well, eventually Eventually, his cup of atrocity started running over, and the Tang of Shang, the leader of a neighboring state, decided to put an end to King Jie's madness. Tang raised an army and overthrew Jie in what would become the Mandate of Heaven, a concept that justified the removal of bad rulers. Tang's motto was pretty much, if you're a terrible ruler, you're gonna get cancelled, dynasty style. After his defeat, King Jie was exiled to a remote area where he eventually died, reportedly still as stubborn and delusional as ever. According to legend, even in his last moments, Jie was so delulu that he insisted the people would one day regret ousting him and realize how great he was. King Leopold II of Belgium. So it's the late 1800s and King Leopold II is lounging in his lavish Belgian palace, sipping tea and eyeing the world map like it's a buffet. The only thing on his mind was how he could conquer more territory and power without spending money on the army. Then, like a light bulb turning on, he had an idea. Africa! Specifically, the Congo, because it was a massive resource-rich region and hadn't been officially claimed by any European power yet. So it's almost like he spotted an unguarded cookie jar and thought, well, don't mind if I do. But here's the crazy part. Leopold didn't just conquer the Congo like other European rulers. Oh no, that would have been too easy. He went full sneaky dictator mode and convinced the international community that he was going into the Congo for philanthropic reasons. That's right, he told everyone he was going to civilize the area, stop the slave trade, and improve the lives of the local people. Well, as you might have guessed, he did the total opposite. Leopold created a personal empire called the Congo Free State, which was actually just a giant cash grab. He exploited the Congo's rubber and ivory for his own personal gain, and let's just say he didn't do it with kindness. This man instructed his soldiers to cut off the hands of workers who didn't meet their quotas to extract rubber, as proof that the soldiers hadn't wasted bullets. This turned the Congo into a living nightmare for its inhabitants, where fear and violence ruled every aspect of daily life. The death toll from Leopold's reign in the Congo was estimated that over 10 to 15 million people were lost due to forced labor, starvation, disease, and violence. It was so bad that even other colonial powers who were not particularly known for being moral leaders themselves started asking him to tone it down a little. When news of the atrocities in the Congo started to leak out thanks to missionaries and journalists, Leopold did what any tyrant would do. He denied everything. Augusto Pinochet. It's September 11th, 1973, and Chile is in political turmoil. The democratically elected President Salvador Allende is trying his best to hang on to power, but things are really getting tense. And then there's Pinochet, who's been a military man through and through, getting ready to make a career move that would leave everyone in shock. According to him, why settle for just being a general when you could snatch the power and be a dictator? Well, he launched a military coup that would go down in history as one of the craziest attempts to steal a country. On that fateful September day, it was full-on military action. We're talking tanks rolling through the streets, jets flying overhead, and military men armed to the teeth with all the heavy artillery. When Pinochet and his army finally bombarded the La Moneda Palace where Allende was holed up, Allende refused to surrender, and he gave a defiant final speech before allegedly taking his own life as the palace fell. Once Pinochet took power, he didn't waste any time turning Chile into a police state. Dissidents, political opponents, intellectuals, basically anyone who disagreed with him were rounded up and either imprisoned, tortured, or disappeared. In fact, an estimated 3,000 people were killed or went missing under Pinochet's regime, while tens of thousands were tortured. By the late 1980s, Pinochet was feeling pretty confident. After all, he'd been ruling with an iron fist for over a decade and seemed unstoppable. So in 1988, when international pressure mounted, Pinochet held a national vote to ask the people if they wanted him to stay in power for another 8 years. Talk about audacity. To his shock and horror, the people said no, and the No campaign, led by opposition forces, won with nearly 56% of the vote. In 1990, Pinochet finally stepped down as president, allowing a transition to democracy. But wait, he wasn't done. He appointed himself commander-in-chief of the army, because apparently stepping down didn't mean actually leaving power. He held on to that position until 1998, and even after that, he became a senator for life, a position he used to dodge prosecution for his crimes. Saddam Hussein. Now, this particular guy wasn't even supposed to rule because he wasn't born or voted into it. He was first a member of the Ba'ath Party, which was basically a party that was all about uniting all Arab nations under one powerful banner. However, Saddam wasn't just interested in their political ideology, but also interested in total control and did everything to get it. By 1979, after playing the political game for years, Saddam took full control of Iraq by arranging a boardroom meeting with all the important people of the state, all under the guise of discussing policies. But in true dictator style, he had them all dragged out and executed immediately because Saddam claimed they were enemies of the state. By the time he finished his political purge, there was really nothing standing in his way of seizing power and becoming the undisputed ruler of Iraq. Now, this guy loved himself and was so self-obsessed that he built statues of him everywhere. His birthday was even celebrated like a national holiday, and schools were full of books glorifying his rule. It's like he was running the world's longest-running self-promotional campaign. But while Saddam was busy making Iraq his personal kingdom, he had a little problem: opposition. One of the most horrific examples of his cruelty was the Al-Anfal campaign in the 1980s, when he targeted the Kurdish population in northern Iraq, accusing them of being traitors. His forces literally unleashed mustard gas on these poor villagers and practically wiped them all out. And in 1988, Saddam's forces once again dropped chemical bombs on the Kurdish town of Halabja, killing around 5,000 people in a single attack. It is recorded today as one of the deadliest chemical attacks on civilizations in history. King Ahab of Israel and his wife Jezebel. To truly understand how evil this king was, you have to first know who he was married to, because she was the one mainly calling the shots. You see, King Ahab married Jezebel, the daughter of the Phoenician king, who brought her idol-worshipping ways with her to Israel. Together, they made it their mission to promote the worship of Baal, the storm god, and turn Israel into a hotbed of idolatry. Jezebel wasn't just bad news, she was the ultimate villain. She persecuted the prophets of Yahweh, ordered executions, and introduced the royal court to all kinds of shady practices. It's like she looked at Ahab and said, "Why settle for being regular evil when we can go for legendary evil?" One of Ahab's most infamous blunders was the whole deal with Naboth's vineyard. So this king saw a lovely piece of land owned by a guy named Naboth and decided he had to have it. But Ahab threw a royal tantrum when Naboth refused to sell because it was ancestral land. He pouted and sulked like a kid who didn't get his dessert. Well, his evil wife Jezebel saw him pouting and egged him to just take the vineyard because he was the king. So she cooked up a plan, framed Naboth for treason, had him stoned to death, and Ahab got his vineyard. It was the ancient equivalent of a real estate deal gone bad, except instead of losing money, Naboth lost his life. Ahab's reign of wickedness eventually caught up to him when he went to battle against the Arameans, despite being warned by the prophet Micaiah that it would end badly. So, instead of listening, Ahab disguised himself as a regular soldier to avoid being targeted. It seems like a smart move, right? Well, wrong. In a twist of fate, a random archer fired an arrow into the sky and bam, it hit Ahab right between the joints of his armor. The arrow wasn't even aimed at him. It was like the universe saying, "You thought you could escape judgment, huh?" Ahab bled out in his chariot, and when his body was taken back to Samaria, dogs licked his blood from the ground, just as the prophet Elijah had predicted. Talk about a poetic and gruesome end. Mistu H Maram. So let's say you were a peasant living in Ethiopia in the late 1970s, where things have already been rough for a while. There's so much political instability and famine looming on the horizon, with violence and murder being the order of the day. Well, in this chaos, a man named Mengistu Haile Mariam takes the opportunity to rise into power. At first, people were cautiously hopeful, thinking he would bring change. But then you notice something strange. Political opponents start disappearing. The minute this guy got into power, it became very clear that he didn't come for peace and unity, but brought the real terror, the Red Terror, to be precise. Mengistu's reign is most infamous for the Red Terror campaign he launched in the late 1970s. Sounds dramatic, right? Well, it was. Basically, Mengistu saw anyone even slightly disagreeing with him as a threat. Rather than just debate or imprison them, he had them systematically murdered by the thousands. Estimates say anywhere from 500 500,000 to 1 million people were killed during the Red Terror. People were dragged from their homes, shot, and left in the streets as warnings to others. Families had to pay for the bullets that killed their loved ones. Let that sink in for a second. Here's your bill for brutally murdering your brother, cash or credit. His reign was so bad that he was nicknamed the Butcher of Addis Ababa. That's right, if your title sounds like something out of a horror movie, you know you're on the wrong side of history. As if the mass killings weren't enough, Mengistu also managed to mismanage a terrible famine that struck Ethiopia in the 1980s. While millions of people starved to death, Mengistu lived in luxury and threw parties all the time. He would literally purposely withhold food from areas that supported opposition groups. Imagine being in a position to help millions of starving people and choosing not to because they didn't vote for you. That's not just bad leadership, it's evil with a capital E. By 1991, things were falling apart for Mengistu. Rebel forces were closing in, and even his own military was starting to turn on him. Instead of sticking around to face justice, Mengistu pulled a fast one and fled to Zimbabwe, where fellow dictator Robert Mugabe granted him asylum. Though Mengistu escaped, he was tried in absentia and convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity, but still lives comfortably in exile in Zimbabwe, much to the frustration of the Ethiopian people who suffered under his rule. King Herod, Judea, 74 to 4 BC. King Herod was a ruler of ancient Judea who took the phrase "absolute power corrupts absolutely" and turned it into his personal mission statement. Born around 74 BC, Herod's reign was a blend of brutal political savvy, paranoia on overdrive, and some truly terrible family dynamics. Imagine Herod as the boss at work who thinks everyone's trying to steal his job and reacts by, well, literally trying to kill them. Herod was so obsessed with keeping his throne that he saw threats in his own family, wives, kids, mother-in-law, you name it, and didn't hesitate to, eliminate them. Even the Roman Emperor Augustus reportedly joked, "It's better to be Herod's pig than his son." And considering the pigs were unclean animals in Jewish culture, that's saying something. Now, things took a turn for the very worse when Herod heard a prophecy that a new king of the Jews had been born. And as someone who was really paranoid about everything, this guy literally ordered the killing of all the male babies in Bethlehem under the age of 2. Now, as Herod got older, his paranoia only got worse. The closer he came to death, the more he feared that nobody would mourn his passing. So, in true Herod fashion, he cooked up a diabolical plan. He ordered that a group of Judea's leading citizens be rounded up and executed on the day he died, so there would be guaranteed mourning in the land, even if it wasn't for him. Imagine being so disliked that you have to schedule some sadness for yourself. Maximilien Robespierre. So, it was the late 1700s in France, and the French Revolution squad was in full swing. Their entire plan was to overthrow the monarchy, but a certain man called Maximilien Robespierre rose to power with his fancy words about democracy, the republic, and virtue. Now, at first glance, this guy looked like he couldn't even hurt a fly. We're talking glasses, an impeccable powdered wig, and the complete scholarly exterior. But under all these exteriors was a man who gave evil an entirely new look. First of all, Robespierre was with virtue, but not in a be nice to your neighbors kind of way. He believed that only the virtuous could lead France to true liberty. And by virtuous, he meant people who agreed with him. Anyone else? Let's just say the only heads up they would get would be from the guillotine's blade. Robespierre thought that terror was the best way to keep people in line and executed around 17,000 people by the guillotine. And that's just the official count. The man turned France into a countrywide episode of Survivor where getting voted off the island was fatal. The irony here is that Robespierre talked about justice and protecting the people, yet anyone who so much as blinked the wrong way found themselves on a one-way trip to Headlessville. You could get guillotined for being an enemy of the revolution, which became a pretty broad category. Maybe you criticized government? Guillotine. Maybe you looked at Robespierre funny? Guillotine. Your favorite color's blue, but Robespierre likes red? Off with your head! He even had people who supported the revolution executed too, just because they weren't pure enough for his high standards of virtue. In one of his most bizarre moments, Robespierre decided that France needed a new religion. So he invented the cult of the Supreme Being and made himself the high priest of this new religion. On June 8, 1794, he organized a massive festival where he led the people in worship of a vague god of reason. There he was in his fancy toga on top of a mountain he'd had built just for the occasion, looking like a deranged combination of Moses and a game show host. Robespierre's downfall came fast, and here's the delicious irony: he was taken down by the very same guillotine he used to terrorize others. On July 27, 1794, Robespierre and 21 of his closest allies were guillotined without trial. Poetic justice, right? It's like writing a book about how much you love guillotines and then becoming the final chapter. Queen Ranavalona I. You know the popular saying, what a man can do, a woman can do better? Well, Queen Ranavalona I, aka Madagascar's Mad Queen, took that challenge very seriously. Now, when you think of queens, you might picture crowns, ball gowns, and royal waves, but Queen Ranavalona's favorite pastime was inventing new ways to terrorize her people. The saddest part of it all was that she wasn't even supposed to be queen by birthright, but she didn't let that stop her. She was the wife of King Radama I, and when he died without an heir, she essentially seized the throne and ruled with an iron fist wrapped in barbed wire. When she took the throne in 1828, Ranavalona started off by securing her power in the way most people in royal families do, a little backstabbing and murder. So from day one, she was more of a why play by the rules when you can just kill the competition kind of queen. Her reign is infamous for the sheer amount of cruelty she inflicted because she made it her personal mission to purge Madagascar of any foreign influence, especially Christian missionaries and European culture, and she found creative ways to cause terror. One of the most popular was the Tangina ordeal. Now, if you're unfortunately accused of a crime, which could be anything from treason to practicing a foreign religion, but instead of a fair trial, you get the ordeal by poison. First of all, you'd be forced to eat 3 pieces of chicken skin and drink the juice of a poisonous nut called Tangina. If you survived without throwing up, then congratulations, you were innocent. But if you threw up, well, you're guilty and dead. And here's the thing, Ranavalona didn't limit this to just a few unlucky souls. Half of her population was subjected to these poison ordeals. That's right, half. It's like running a nationwide Hunger Games, but instead of arrows, it's nuts that could kill you. Queen Ranavalona is often blamed for reducing Madagascar's population by 50% during her reign. Half the population either died from executions, poison trials, overwork, or plain old fear-induced exhaustion. Despite all this horror, she managed to stay in power for 33 years. Think about that. 33 years of relentless brutality. It's like being stuck in a really bad movie where the villain just never dies. Until 1861, where she finally passed away, leaving a trail of blood, fear, and devastation in her wake. Papa Doc Duvalier. Papa Doc, whose real name was Francois Duvalier, didn't just walk into power, he stomped in, wearing some very shiny boots. The crazy part is that this guy started as a doctor. Yes, you heard that right, a doctor. He even helped fight tropical diseases like typhus and malaria. But somewhere along the way, he traded in his stethoscope for a dictator's throne. By the time he was running for president in 1957, Papa Doc was already showing signs that he wasn't exactly the kindly village doctor anymore. Now, here's where it gets dark. Papa Doc didn't just want to be president. He wanted to be Haiti's eternal ruler. He rigged the election to win, then declared himself president for life, which is dictator speak for I'm never leaving unless I'm in a coffin. Now, once in power, Papa Doc turned Haiti into his personal playground. If playgrounds were filled with fear, oppression, and bizarre rituals, he created a personal militia called the Tonton Makou, which is a term for a mythological boogeyman. Essentially, he made sure everyone in Haiti had a good reason to stay on his good side, or else they might face the Tonton Macoute. Talk about a spooky game of hide-and-seek. One of the most terrifying things about Papa Doc was how he used voodoo to control the population. He basically convinced people he had actual supernatural powers and claimed he could control Baron Samedi, the voodoo spirit of death, and would often show up in public wearing dark glasses and black clothing, basically cosplaying as death himself. While Papa Doc was busy playing voodoo god king, Haiti was falling apart. The economy tanked, poverty skyrocketed, people were starving, but he was more concerned about making sure he stayed in power than doing anything about it. He and his cronies drained the country's resources, enriching themselves while the people suffered. Papa Doc stayed in power until 1971, when he died of natural causes. Jean Bedel Bokassa, Central African Republic. Jean Bedel Bokassa, or as he preferred to be called, Emperor Bokassa I, is what happens when someone watches too many movies about kings and emperors and thinks he can do the same in real life. The guy's reign over the Central African Republic, which he literally turned into the Central African Empire, was one of the most bizarre and brutal episodes in modern history. Bokassa started his career as a soldier, serving in the French colonial army, but returned to his homeland and became head of the army after the Central African Republic gained independence. Now, here's where the story starts to get messy. In 1966, Bokassa overthrew his cousin, President David Dacko, in a coup because, well, he thought he could run the country better. Spoiler, he could not. At first, Bokassa was just your regular dictator, ruling the Central African Republic with an iron fist. But then, he got a little too into the whole power thing, and in 1977, he took things to a whole new level and declared himself Emperor Bokassa I, staging a coronation that was so over the top it made royal weddings look like a backyard barbecue. Bokassa's coronation cost $20 million, which is about a third of the country's entire budget. Think about that. The Central African Republic was one of the poorest countries in the world, but Bokassa wanted to live out his Napoleon fantasy, so he splurged on this grand event. He even had horses flown in from France and decked himself out in a crown worth $5 million, because nothing says for the people like dressing up in a gold-embroidered robe while your citizens are struggling to find food. The worst part of his reign was that he also practiced cannibalism. Yeah, roasting and eating the flesh of literal humans. This crazy man even arrested and killed over 100 kids, all because they were protesting a decree that required them to buy school uniforms from a company owned by Bokassa's wife. He allegedly even beat some of them to death personally, and this act of insensitive cruelty became the final straw for his regime. Even France, which had been backing him for years, was tired of his insanity at this point. So in 1979, during a military operation called Operation Barracuda, they deposed him while he was on an away trip to Libya. In classic dictator fashion, Bokassa had to flee, and he lived in exile in France, but tried to return to the Central African Republic in the 1980s, hoping for a comeback. He was swiftly arrested for murder, embezzlement, treason, and even cannibalism. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Well, good riddance. Mobutu Sese Seko. So, just picture this. It's the 1960s. Congo just gained independence from Belgium, and the place is falling apart faster than a house with a bad foundation during a storm. And this is where Mobutu Sese Seko enters and promises the people peace, stability, and order. Well, that promise was tossed out of the window like a dirty diaper immediately after he became president in 1965. Instead of thinking about his country's current issues, the first thing Seko did was change the country's name to Zaire, and gave himself a super long name that translates to something like the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. Mobutu quickly realized he didn't need to work hard to lead. He just needed to work hard at stealing everything that wasn't nailed down. And boy, did he. Mobutu turned Zaire's treasury into his personal piggy bank. Imagine a national leader holding up a country like a bank robber with a sack over his shoulder, but the sack's full of diamonds, gold, and basically the entire economy. At this point, Mobutu was one of the richest people in the world, with an estimated $5 billion stolen from his people. control. In one of his weirdest moves of his dictatorship, Mobutu launched an authenticity campaign in the 1970s. He wanted to rid Zaire of its colonial influences, so he banned Western clothes, renamed cities, and made everyone drop their Christian name in favor of African names. Meanwhile, while he preached authenticity and African pride, Mobutu was still flying off to Europe for shopping sprees and luxury vacations. Finally, after 32 years of this dictator fashion show, Mobutu's reign collapsed in 1997. The country was already in shambles, and when neighboring Rwanda and Uganda-backed rebels led by Laurent Désiré Kabila came knocking, Mobutu's army just gave up. Turns out soldiers who aren't paid very well don't want to fight for a guy who's hoarding all the wealth. Mobutu fled into exile, leaving Zaire, now renamed the Democratic Republic of Congo, to clean up the massive mess he left behind. He lived the rest of his days in Morocco, where he died of cancer in 1997, far away from the country he destroyed. He's in Habré, Chad. Habré was basically the guy who shows up to the party uninvited, kicks everyone out, then burns the house down to make a statement. He was originally a rebel leader, fighting to take control of the country, and in 1982 he finally overthrew the government and became president. And once Habré had his hands on power, he wasn't about to let it go. He ruled with a simple motto: you disagree, you disappear. One of the first things Habré did when he became president was to create the DDS, Directorate of Documentation and Security, which sounds like a boring government office, but was actually his own private torture squad. If Habré suspected you of opposing him, or even if you looked at him funny, the DDS would drag you to a secret prison for a little chat. And by chat, we are talking torture so brutal it would make medieval dungeons look like spas. They used methods like electric shocks, burning people with acid, and of course, the old classic of beating people senseless. Habré didn't discriminate, so anyone could end up in these prisons: men, women, children, and even old people. Habré wasn't content with just torturing people in secret. He decided to go big and commit genocide while he was at it. His regime was responsible for targeting entire ethnic groups, especially the Sahara, Hajarai, and Chadian Arabs. So if you belonged to any of these groups, you were automatically seen as a threat, and he was determined to eliminate that threat by any means necessary. Thousands were killed in cold blood, either in mass executions or brutal raids carried out by his military. His cruelty was on a grand scale, and he didn't care if it meant wiping out entire communities to stay in power. The DDS even encouraged people to snitch on each other, and sometimes they'd arrest you based on nothing more than a rumor. You could literally be arrested because someone said, "Hey, I think they don't like Habré," and boom, you're off to the torture chambers. It was like living in a horror movie where everyone was both a victim and a potential villain. Finally, in 1990, Habré's brutal regime came to an end. It was like a bad TV show getting cancelled after too many seasons. Rebel forces led by Idriss Déby stormed the capital, and instead of going down with a fight, Habré decided it was time to flee. He grabbed his stolen riches and headed to Senegal, leaving Chad to pick up the pieces of his shattered dictatorship. There have been so many instances of evil rulers who made life hell for people, and if you want to hear more about them, start now by simply joining our Discord server. Ephraim Rios Monat. It all started in 1982 when Rios Monat decided that Guatemala didn't need regular elections or democracy. It needed him, of course. He came to power after a military coup, and the first thing he did was wrap himself in the Bible. And in case anyone missed the memo, he frequently cited his deep Christian beliefs while, burning villages and ordering mass executions. "Thou shalt not kill unless it's part of my counterinsurgency plan." Now, if you thought other dictators were cruel, wait until you hear about Rios Monat's scorched earth policy aimed at anyone he saw as an op. So basically, the guerrilla fighters and the indigenous Mayan population. And his solution was to send his army into villages, burn everything down, massacre men, and mutilate the women and children before executing them in the most horrific ways. Many were bludgeoned to death or thrown alive into a well, and any survivors would be forced into army-controlled settlements. In total, an estimated 75,000 civilians were killed during his time in power, with countless more displaced and traumatized. This guy was practically wiping out entire communities like he was hitting the delete button on real life. And the fucked up part of the whole thing was was that he justified all his cruelty with religion. He seemed to believe that he was fighting some sort of holy war, and anyone who opposed him, indigenous people, leftists, journalists, even innocent bystanders, was part of the enemy. In one of his famous speeches, he declared, "If you're with us, we'll feed you. If you're against us, we'll kill you." He even had a freaking policy known as the frijoles o balas, which is the beans or bullets program. The idea was simple. If you supported the government, you got beans, but if you didn't, you'd get bullets. Despite all his fire and brimstone rhetoric, Rios Manat's dictatorship came to an end in 1983 when he was overthrown by his own military. Turns out, even a dictator who thinks he's on a holy mission can't escape mutiny when his policies are destroying the country. Justice finally caught up with him in 2013 when he was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity. However, his conviction was overturned on a technicality, but the world had already seen enough evidence to know that Rios Manat's hands were soaked in blood. He died in 2018 while under house arrest, never fully serving his punishment.